The office froze when he slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "You're fired!" I remember the sound of his palm hitting the polished wooden table more vividly than the ticking of the clock that morning. It wasn't just the noise. It was the force behind it, the way it seemed to echo through every corner of the room, silencing the chatter of keyboards, cutting through the murmur of voices, and freezing the air itself. All at once, the office went still, every pair of eyes lifting toward the source of that thunderous command. The boss, our boss, stood tall, his suit tailored to perfection, his tie gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his face twisted with anger that made him look larger than life. And his voice, sharp and merciless, sliced through the silence. "You're fired!" For a moment no one breathed. The words hung heavy in the air, shocking in their finality, leaving the entire room stunned. The man they were directed at stood trembling near his desk, his worn-out shoes planted on the carpet, his calloused hands shaking as if he was clinging to the last thread of dignity left to him. He was late. That was his crime. Just a few minutes past the hour, and now his entire livelihood was being torn away from him in front of everyone. The boss's face carried the arrogance of a man who had never known hunger, never known what it meant to count coins at a grocery store, or wonder if tomorrow's meal would appear on the table. His tone wasn't just strict. It was cruel, dripping with disdain, as though he found personal satisfaction in the humiliation he was inflicting. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the poor man, his voice booming louder. "This company does not tolerate incompetence. If you cannot even respect time, you do not belong here." The poor man's lips quivered as he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His voice was trapped in his throat, swallowed by the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. Around him, co-workers stared, some pretending to focus on their screens, others darting glances that betrayed their discomfort. Nobody dared to intervene. Nobody dared to say, "Sir, maybe we should listen first." Because in that office, his word was law, and his wrath was a storm no one wished to stand in the way of. The poor man lowered his head, his eyes falling to the floor, his silence louder than anything he could have said. His uniform shirt, slightly faded from too many washes, hung loosely on his thin frame, and his trousers carried the wrinkles of a man who had no luxury of ironing every morning. He had always walked in quietly, never causing trouble, never raising his voice, doing his work with a humility that often went unnoticed. But today, every flaw, every imperfection was magnified under the burning gaze of the boss, who saw him as nothing more than disposable. What struck me most wasn't just the harshness of the firing, it was the performance of it. The boss could have called him into his office, spoken to him privately, given him a warning, or even asked a question before condemning him. But no. He chose the public stage of the office floor, the drama of raised voices and slamming hands, to make an example out of him. It wasn't discipline, it was domination. It was the flexing of power, the reminder to everyone in that room that he controlled not just our jobs, but our dignity, our worth, our very sense of belonging. The poor man gathered his few belongings slowly, each movement heavy, deliberate, as if time itself had slowed around him. He picked up a small, worn notebook, a pen with fading ink, and a lunchbox dented from years of use. His hands trembled as he placed them into a tattered bag, and in that trembling, the story of his life was written. Years of struggle, nights of hunger, mornings of sacrifice, all condensed into the quiet shame of packing up while the world watched. The boss, meanwhile, adjusted his cufflinks, leaned back in his chair, and exhaled with satisfaction, as if he had restored order to his kingdom. His arrogance filled the room like smoke, choking the air, suffocating those who dared breathe too loud. He didn't glance twice at the man he had just condemned, didn't care to ask why he was late, didn't wonder what circumstances had led to that moment. To him, the poor man was just a weak link cut away to preserve the chain of his authority. But what none of us knew then, what even he didn't know, was that the story wasn't ending with that slammed table and those two merciless words. The story was only beginning. As the poor man slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the door, his back slightly hunched, his steps slow and heavy, the office remained silent. Some eyes followed him with pity, others with fear, a few with relief that it wasn't them this time. I watched him closely, the way he avoided every gaze, the way his lips pressed tightly together to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. He didn't deserve this. Nobody did. And yet here he was, walking out of the door, stripped of dignity, stripped of livelihood, carrying the invisible weight of a punishment far harsher than the crime. I glanced back at the boss. He was already moving on, already shifting his attention to the next task, the next meeting, as if firing a man in front of everyone was no more significant to him than brushing lint off his jacket. To him, it was over. To him, it was finished. But the truth has a way of creeping into the cracks of arrogance, of seeping into the spaces where power believes it is untouchable. That day, we thought we had witnessed the end of a man's career. But what we had actually witnessed was the beginning of something much larger, something that would shake the very man who had declared himself untouchable. But little did he know, the reason for that delay was about to change everything. For the poor man, every minute wasn't just time. It was survival. I remember watching him leave the office that day, his steps heavy and his shoulders stooped under the invisible weight of a burden none of us fully understood. To us, being late seemed like a small mistake, a few minutes lost in the shuffle of the morning rush. But for him, those minutes were not just a matter of punctuality. They were the difference between holding on to a fragile life and losing everything he had fought so hard to keep. Every tick of the clock carried consequences. Every second bore the weight of a family's survival. His life was nothing like the polished offices where we sat, or the gleaming homes where our boss slept each night. He lived in a small, crumbling apartment on the far side of the city, in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered weakly and the sound of traffic never ceased. The walls of his home were thin, the paint chipped, and the windows rattled in the wind, as if they too struggled to hold their place. Inside, the furniture was old, handed down or found second-hand, each piece carrying not elegance but endurance. There were no luxuries, no decorations to please the eye, only the bare essentials of survival. His wife, a woman with kind but weary eyes, worked small cleaning jobs whenever she could, scrubbing floors and wiping windows in other people's houses, building a life out of the pennies she could gather. Their children, two of them, a boy and a girl, were the center of their world. The boy was in high school, his shoes worn thin, the soles patched with glue more than once, while the girl was still in elementary school, her backpack frayed at the edges, but clutched tightly as though it were the greatest treasure she owned. They didn't complain. They didn't ask for more than their parents could give. But even children who smile through hardship cannot hide the quiet hunger in their eyes when meals are smaller than they should be. For this man, every morning began long before the sun rose. He would wake in the dim gray light, his alarm ringing in the tiny kitchen where the clock hung crooked on the wall. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, moved slowly as he washed his face in cold water, for hot water was a luxury their broken heater could not always provide. His breakfast was simple, often just a piece of bread or tea if they could afford it. Many mornings he left without eating, choosing instead to leave what little food they had for his children. The journey to work was no simple matter. He traveled across the city, relying on buses that never came on time, on trains that were often overcrowded, on his own 2 feet when neither option was available. Rain, snow, or blazing sun, he made that journey, because the paycheck at the end of the month was the fragile thread that held his world together. Being late was not his habit, nor was it negligence. It was the consequence of living a life where nothing was ever guaranteed, where the systems of the city and the weight of poverty often conspired against him. And yet, despite this endless struggle, he clung to his job with everything he had. To him, the insults of the boss were daggers, yes, but daggers he endured in silence, because the alternative, unemployment, was a monster far more terrifying. Losing this job meant losing the rent money, losing the little food they managed to place on the table, losing the chance to keep his children in school, where he prayed they would someday rise above the hardships that had bound him all his life. His dignity might have been battered, but his responsibility to his family was the anchor that kept him standing. I remember visiting his neighborhood once, though not by intention. I had taken a wrong turn after leaving a meeting across town, and by chance, I passed through the narrow, crowded streets where he lived. There were children playing barefoot in alleys, mothers hanging laundry on sagging lines, men returning from day jobs with tired expressions etched into their faces. And then I saw him, walking toward his building with a bag of groceries, so small it looked almost pitiful. He walked with his head bowed, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion, every step a reminder of the weight he carried. Yet when he entered his building, the first thing I heard was laughter, his children rushing to greet him, their voices filled with joy, as though the world outside their door did not exist. It struck me then how little we understood of his world. To the boss, he was just an employee, a man who had failed to respect the clock. But in reality, he was a father who stretched himself thin, a husband who endured humiliation to keep food on the table, a man whose sacrifices were invisible to those who judged him most harshly. Poverty is not just the absence of money. It is the constant presence of fear, the gnawing worry that one misstep, one delay, one dismissal could unravel everything. And yet, what amazed me most was his quiet endurance. He never shouted, never argued, never tried to explain himself when mocked. He bore it all with a silence that was not weakness but strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing you have no choice but to endure. Behind that silence was love. Love for his family that outweighed his own pride, love that made every insult bearable because the survival of those he cherished depended on it. That day, after being fired so cruelly, I imagined him returning to that small apartment, his heart heavy, his shoulders stooped, his mind racing with fear. How would he tell his wife? How would he look into the eyes of his children and explain that their future had just grown even more uncertain? The weight of poverty is not just in the empty wallet. It is in the shame of not being able to provide, the guilt of watching your children go without, the silent tears of a parent who wishes he could give more. But here is where the story took a turn none of us expected. The boss thought he had stripped the man of everything, thought his words had crushed him into dust. And yet, when the sun rose the next morning, when the office doors opened once again, something remarkable happened. And yet, despite everything, he showed up the next day with a quiet dignity that stunned everyone. To him, being late was unforgivable, because he had never known struggle. The more I thought about that day, the more I realized that the fury in his voice, the slam of his hand against the table, and the cold dismissal of a man's livelihood had less to do with punctuality and more to do with pride. For the boss, lateness was not a minor fault. It was a personal insult, a challenge to the rigid order he believed he alone had established. He had built his world on control, on discipline so strict that any deviation felt like rebellion. And in his mind, rebellion deserved nothing less than humiliation and expulsion. But the reason he held this view so tightly was simple. He had never known struggle. He had never once stood on the edge of survival, where minutes meant the difference between food on the table or hunger gnawing at the stomachs of your children. To him, time was not survival. It was power. I remember the way he strutted through the office every morning, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the fluorescent lights above, his suit pressed so perfectly it looked as though it had been sculpted for him by the hands of artisans. His tie, always silk, always rich in color, hung like a badge of authority, and his cufflinks gleamed with the kind of wealth that was meant to be noticed. His hair was slicked back, his face clean-shaven, his expression sharp and unreadable, except when twisted into the smirk of superiority he wore whenever someone beneath him faltered. He did not walk. He commanded. Every step was a declaration of ownership, not just over the space he occupied, but over the lives of the people who worked under him. His obsession with discipline extended into every detail of the company. Meetings began at exact minutes. Reports had to be submitted with flawless precision, and even casual conversations were timed by the invisible clock he carried in his mind. He often said, "If you cannot respect time, you cannot respect success." To him, lateness was a disease, a virus that if tolerated once would spread through his empire like rot. But beneath that obsession was something far darker, an inability to understand that not all lateness was born of laziness, that sometimes the world itself conspires against those who do not have the wealth to shield themselves from its chaos. He could not fathom this truth because he had never lived it. His mornings were spent in luxury cars that glided through traffic, his evenings in penthouses untouched by the noise of the streets below. He lived above struggle, both literally and figuratively. His coldness toward employees was not just a habit, it was a philosophy. He believed that fear produced results, that humiliation ensured obedience. I had seen him reduce grown men to silence with a single cutting remark, women to tears with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a scathing word. He never apologized, never reconsidered, never admitted fault. To him, mistakes belonged to others. His role was only to expose them, to strip away the fragile layers of confidence his employees tried to build and remind them that their worth existed only in their usefulness to his empire. Loyalty did not move him. Sacrifice did not touch him. Effort did not matter unless it aligned perfectly with his expectations. And when it did not, he crushed it without hesitation. In private, his life was a study in excess. While the poor man lived in a cramped apartment with flickering lights and worn furniture, the boss resided in a sprawling estate on the city's wealthiest hill. His home overlooked the skyline like a throne watching over a kingdom, its walls made of glass and marble, its rooms decorated with art worth more than the yearly salaries of his entire staff. Chandeliers glistened in every hall, each crystal carefully chosen, each light designed to sparkle like wealth itself. His garage housed cars that never saw dust, their engines purring like tame beasts awaiting their master's command. His kitchen overflowed with imported goods, his closets lined with suits and shoes crafted by the most exclusive designers. Even the air he breathed seemed different, filtered, perfumed, untouched by the grit of the streets that wore down men like the one he had fired. The contrast was staggering. While one man counted coins late at night to decide whether milk could be afforded, the other drank wines that had been aged longer than some of his employees had been alive. While one man patched the soles of shoes with glue, the other discarded pairs after a season, never worn more than a handful of times. And yet, despite the glaring differences between their worlds, it was the rich man who judged, who condemned, who mocked the struggles he could not possibly comprehend. He believed that his wealth was not just privilege, but proof of superiority, evidence that he was somehow more disciplined, more intelligent, more deserving. Poverty, in his eyes, was a symptom of weakness, a lack of effort, a failure of character. That is why, when the poor man arrived late, there was no space in his mind for mercy. No thought that the lateness could have been caused by forces beyond control. No consideration that this man had shown loyalty and dedication for years. His pride would not allow such compassion, because compassion, to him, was weakness. He needed to show everyone that lateness was rebellion, that rebellion was unforgivable, and that unforgivable acts would be crushed without hesitation. And so he slammed his hand, raised his voice, and dismissed the man as though he were nothing more than a broken cog in the machine of his empire. But arrogance, like glass, always carries cracks invisible at first glance. For all his wealth, for all his pride, the boss was blind. Blind to the truth of the man he had fired. Blind to the sacrifices that lateness had concealed. Blind to the fact that sometimes true strength does not reside in polished suits and golden offices, but in the resilience of those who endure without complaint. His pride had created a fortress around him, one that kept out the messiness of real life, but also blinded him to the humanity of the people who built his empire brick by brick. He believed himself untouchable. He believed himself flawless. But arrogance has a way of leading even the powerful into their downfall. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the powerful. And he was blind to the truth. The office whispered long after the poor man left, but no one dared to speak aloud. The silence after his departure was unlike any silence I had ever known inside those walls. It was not the silence of concentration, not the focused hum of workers bent over keyboards or flipping through files. It was the silence of unease, heavy and suffocating, pressing against our chests until even the sound of a pen scratching across paper felt intrusive. We had all watched him leave, his head lowered, his bag slung awkwardly over his shoulder, his steps slow as though each one carried the weight of 1,000 invisible stones. And though his figure disappeared beyond the glass doors, his presence lingered, echoing in the tightness of our throats and the downward glances we shared, but never held for long. No one dared to speak openly, not when the boss sat at his desk like a king who had just executed a subject for daring to challenge his rule. His eyes scanned the room with the coldness of a hunter, searching for even the faintest flicker of defiance. The memory of his hand slamming against the table was still fresh in our ears, a reminder of how easily he could reduce any one of us to nothing. So instead of words, we whispered when he wasn't looking. We exchanged fleeting glances, nervous half-smiles that carried more fear than comfort, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was this fair? The truth is, fairness did not matter in that office. Power did, and power demanded silence. Some workers leaned close to each other, murmuring under their breath about how cruel it had been, about how unnecessary the spectacle was. A few dared to shake their heads in quiet disbelief, their lips pressed tight, as though sealing away the outrage they did not have the courage to voice. Others, however, pretended nothing had happened at all, their fingers tapping against keyboards, their eyes fixed on screens that blurred beneath the fog of guilt. They convinced themselves that if they ignored it, if they buried the memory under the weight of deadlines and tasks, they would be safe. I knew the truth. They weren't ignoring it out of apathy. They were ignoring it out of fear. Because in that office, words had consequences. To speak out against the boss was to invite his wrath, to risk being the next one humiliated, the next one dismissed, the next one forced to gather their belongings under the heavy gaze of co-workers too frightened to intervene. And so, we all carried our opinions in silence, our outrage reduced to whispers that evaporated as quickly as they formed. But silence does not erase injustice, it only deepens it. I can still see the image of the poor man's quiet exit burned into my mind. He didn't protest, didn't plead, didn't even look back at the people who had sat beside him for years. His silence was not resignation. It was dignity. The kind of dignity that comes from knowing that words, in that moment, would be wasted, that no explanation would matter to a man blinded by pride. His silence spoke louder than any argument could have. It told us that he had endured worse than this, that he had carried heavier burdens than humiliation, and that no matter what, he would not give the boss the satisfaction of seeing him break. That, perhaps, was what unsettled us most, because in his quiet departure, he held more strength than any of us had in our fearful silence. As the door closed behind him, the boss leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as though nothing of consequence had happened. To him, it was a victory, a demonstration of authority, a warning to all of us. His smirk lingered, his expression daring anyone to challenge him. But no one did. We lowered our heads, returned to our work, and pretended not to hear the whispers that trickled through the air like restless ghosts. I remember one co-worker leaning toward another, their voices barely audible. "He has children," she whispered. "What will they do now?" The other shook his head quickly, his eyes darting nervously toward the boss. "Don't talk about it," he hissed back. "Do you want to lose your job too?" That was the cruel reality. Compassion was a risk. Empathy was dangerous. And so we swallowed both, choking them down like bitter medicine, all while guilt gnawed at us from the inside. The tension lingered long after the boss retreated to his office, closing the door behind him with a sharp click. On the surface, the office returned to normal. The clicking of keys resumed, phones rang, papers shuffled. But beneath that thin veneer of routine lay a heaviness that refused to be ignored. The air felt thicker, our shoulders more rigid, our breaths uneven. We had not just witnessed a man lose his job. We had witnessed a man lose his dignity, and our silence had been the seal on his punishment. I stared at the empty desk where he had once sat, the chair still pulled slightly away from the table, the faint indent of his weight lingering in the cushion. His notebook remained, left behind in the chaos of his dismissal, its pages filled with neat handwriting, reminders, and to-do lists that now had no future. The sight of it broke something in me, a reminder that he had not just been an employee, but a human being, one with routines, responsibilities, and people waiting for him at home. And now all of it had been swept away with two careless words. "You're fired." The others avoided looking at the desk, as though even glancing at it would implicate them in the injustice. But I couldn't tear my eyes away, because behind the whispers, behind the silence, there was one truth none of us could escape. It could have been any of us. And perhaps that was why we stayed quiet. Because deep down, we knew that the moment we stood up for someone else, we would stand alone. But while the rest of us buried our guilt under silence, there was a part of me that refused to let it end there. As the day dragged on, and the whispers faded into routine, a seed of unease took root inside me. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the look on his face as he walked away, about the quiet dignity that clung to him despite the humiliation. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what had truly happened, because lateness alone could not define a man's worth, and something in my gut told me there was more to his story than we had seen. And yet, one person decided to follow him, to uncover what no one else dared to ask. The truth behind his lateness was not carelessness. It was sacrifice. When the door closed behind him that morning and the office swallowed the silence he had left behind, none of us truly knew the reason for his delay. To us, it was nothing but speculation. Traffic, forgetfulness, laziness, excuses that seemed unworthy of mention. That is what the boss wanted us to believe. That is what he had framed it as. A man who could not respect the clock, a worker too careless to deserve his place. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was nothing like that. The truth was heavier, heartbreaking, and far more powerful than any of us could have imagined. His lateness wasn't born of negligence. It was born of sacrifice. That morning, long before the sun rose, while the rest of us still rested in the comfort of our beds, his day had already begun in chaos. His wife had fallen ill during the night, her breathing ragged, her body trembling with fever that refused to break. Their small apartment, with its peeling paint and drafty windows, had become a furnace of worry as he pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering words of comfort he did not believe. They had no money for doctors, no health insurance to rely on, only his calloused hands and desperate prayers. And yet, as much as his heart ached to stay by her side, the clock reminded him of another duty. His children stirred in their small beds, rubbing sleep from their eyes, unaware of the storm pressing against their father's chest. The boy needed his school uniform washed and ready. The girl needed breakfast before the long walk to her elementary school. They were too young to carry the weight of illness, too innocent to see the fear etched into their father's face. So, while his wife lay shivering in their bedroom, he pulled himself together, forcing his body to move faster than his heart wanted. He rushed through the tiny kitchen, scraping together the last pieces of bread, spreading what little butter remained, and wrapping it carefully in paper for their lunches. He filled 2 small cups with watered-down tea, setting them on the table with a smile he did not feel. His son noticed the tiredness in his eyes. His daughter asked why their mother was not at the table, but he brushed their questions aside with gentle words. "She's resting," he said softly. "Eat quickly. You must not be late." He could not tell them that the real lateness belonged to him, that every passing minute pushed him closer to the moment his boss would judge him without mercy. After sending them off, he returned to his wife's side, his hands trembling as he tucked the blanket tighter around her frail body. She tried to speak, to tell him to go, but her voice cracked under the strain. "Don't lose your job because of me," she whispered, her words a plea wrapped in pain. He kissed her forehead, his heart breaking, torn between the duty of a husband and the duty of an employee. He lingered too long. His love held him in place when time screamed for him to leave. And in that moment, he made the choice that sealed his fate. He chose humanity over job security. He chose to be a husband first, a worker second. By the time he left the apartment, the sun had already begun to rise, painting the cracked walls of the neighborhood in pale gold. He ran down the uneven streets, his bag bouncing against his shoulder, his lungs burning as he chased the bus that had already pulled away from the stop. He caught the next one, but it was crowded. Every seat filled, every aisle pressed shoulder to shoulder with tired workers just like him, all of them carrying their own stories of sacrifice. The bus crawled through the city, trapped in traffic that seemed endless, the minutes ticking away mercilessly. He tapped his foot, clenched his fists, prayed under his breath, but the wheels turned slower than his pounding heart. And still, he did not give up. When the bus reached its final stop, still blocks away from the office, he jumped out and ran again, weaving through pedestrians, his shoes slapping against the pavement. Sweat poured down his face, his breath came in gasps, but he kept running, because he knew what waited for him on the other side of the glass doors. A man who would never understand. A man who would not ask. A man who saw only the crime of lateness, not the love that had caused it. By the time he arrived, his shirt clung to his body, his hair damp, his eyes red from exhaustion. He straightened his posture, wiped his face with his sleeve, and forced his breathing to steady before stepping into the office. But the clock betrayed him. The clock had already written his sentence. And before he could even take his seat, before he could explain, before he could beg for the chance to be understood, the boss had slammed his hand on the table and declared him unworthy. That was the truth of his delay. It was not laziness. It was not negligence. It was sacrifice. The sacrifice of a man torn between love and livelihood, between duty to family and duty to employer. And though the boss believed he had dismissed a failure, what he had truly dismissed was a man who carried more strength in his silence than the boss could ever hope to understand. When I learned this truth later, it crushed me. It made me realize how blind we had all been, how easily we had accepted the narrative of arrogance without ever stopping to ask what lay beneath. We had witnessed the humiliation, but we had not witnessed the reason. And in that gap between perception and reality lay the tragedy of his dismissal. The emotional weight of his choice was unbearable to imagine. To stay by his wife's side was to risk the roof over their heads. To rush to work was to leave the woman he loved in pain and fear. No matter which choice he made, he would lose something. And so he chose the path of sacrifice, knowing he would suffer the consequences, but unwilling to abandon his humanity. That was his crime. He cared too much. And yet, the irony of it all was that his silence in the face of humiliation only strengthened his dignity. Because when the boss raised his voice, when he laughed at the lateness, when he dismissed him as worthless, the poor man knew the truth in his own heart. He knew why he had been late. He knew that his lateness had been born not of weakness, but of love. And the boss thought he had fired a failure, but in truth, he had dismissed a hero. Rumors began to circulate. This was no ordinary case of being late. In the days that followed his dismissal, the office tried to resume its rhythm, but the silence he left behind clung to us like a shadow. We clicked away at keyboards, shuffled through papers, and answered phones. Yet beneath the mechanical motions of routine, something stirred restlessly. The truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. And slowly, like threads of smoke curling into the air, whispers began to spread. They were quiet at first, murmured in corners, exchanged in hurried breaks by the vending machines, but they carried weight, and the weight of those whispers began to shift the ground beneath the very man who had slammed his hand against the table and declared another man's life worthless. This was no ordinary lateness, I overheard one voice say, hushed but urgent. He wasn't careless. Something happened at home. Another replied, I heard his wife was sick, burning with fever. He stayed to take care of her before coming. Still another claimed, he has 2 children, doesn't he? Maybe he had to get them ready for school. Maybe that's why. The stories, varied, details changing from one mouth to the next, but all of them carried a common truth. His delay had not been laziness. It had been born of responsibility, of love, of struggle far greater than the boss could comprehend. At first, the boss dismissed the murmurs with the same arrogance that had shaped his every action. I saw him roll his eyes when the fragments reached his ears, brushing them aside with a wave of his hand, as if they were nothing more than dust. Excuses, he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. People always have excuses when they fail. His voice carried the same sharpness, the same iron certainty that had cut the poor man down. But arrogance is a fragile shield, and even the smallest cracks can let doubt seep through. It was subtle at first, a shift in his posture when someone mentioned the man's name, a narrowing of the eyes when another whispered about illness, a pause in his stride when talk of family responsibilities reached him. Irritation etched itself deeper into his features, not because he cared, but because his authority was being questioned in the shadows. He could not tolerate the idea that his decision might be viewed as unfair, that his empire might whisper behind his back. Power, for him, thrived on unquestioned obedience, and the whispers gnawed at its edges like termites beneath polished wood. But irritation soon twisted into something else. Curiosity. I noticed it in the way he lingered by conversations, pretending to adjust his cufflinks, while his ears strained to catch fragments of what was being said. I noticed it in the way his eyes flicked toward the empty desk the poor man had left behind, as though the ghost of that silence held answers he could not reach. He would never admit it aloud. His pride would never allow it. But the whispers unsettled him. Because if they were true, if the man he had fired had been late not because of laziness, but because of sacrifice, then everything he believed about control, discipline, and authority would be challenged. His throne would not appear as sturdy. His power would not appear as righteous. And the arrogance he wore like armor would begin to feel like a lie. The tension in the office grew with every passing day. It was no longer just the whispers themselves, but the way they changed the air around us. People glanced at the boss differently now, not openly but cautiously, as though testing whether his certainty was truly as unshakable as he claimed. The atmosphere buzzed with a strange electricity, the kind that comes when truth threatens to rise to the surface. And though the boss tried to smother it with his cold demeanor, even he could not silence the unease creeping into his own mind. I remember the moment it shifted most clearly. He had gathered us for a meeting, his voice steady, his posture rigid, his words sharp as ever. But when one of the senior staff, a man who had served loyally for years, hesitated before responding, the boss snapped, "Out with it!" The staff member cleared his throat, his voice trembling just enough to betray his nerves. "It's just, sir, some of us are wondering. Maybe he wasn't late without reason. Maybe there was something more." The silence that followed was deafening. The boss's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. For a moment, I thought he would explode, that he would reduce the man to rubble with words sharper than knives. But instead, something flickered across his face, something I had never seen before. Doubt. He dismissed the meeting quickly after that, his voice more clipped than usual, his hands fidgeting with his papers in a way that betrayed unease. And from that day on, I could see the battle inside him growing. His pride demanded that he ignore the whispers, that he crush them beneath his authority. But his mind, restless and gnawed at by doubt, demanded answers. He began to ask questions, not directly, never openly, but in ways that betrayed his growing curiosity. He called one employee into his office under the guise of reviewing their work, only to slip in a question about whether they knew where the poor man had lived. He lingered by the water cooler longer than usual, listening as two assistants exchanged hushed words about the man's sick wife. He even sent one of his drivers to run an errand that conveniently passed through the neighborhood where the man's family lived. And with each detail that reached him, his irritation deepened, because the picture that began to form was not of a careless worker who had failed his duties. It was of a husband, a father, a man who had carried responsibilities far heavier than any report or deadline. And the realization began to scratch against the boss's pride, threatening to expose the fragility of the empire he had built on arrogance. He tried to silence the doubts with anger, convincing himself that even if the rumors were true, lateness was still unacceptable, that discipline must always come before compassion. But late at night, when the office emptied and only his reflection stared back at him from the dark glass of his skyscraper windows, I knew the whispers returned to him louder than ever, because arrogance can dismiss reason, but it cannot silence conscience. And then, one afternoon, a fragment of truth slipped through, a detail so sharp, so undeniable, that it pierced through the shield of his pride and left him shaken. It came not from whispers, but from evidence, something tangible, something he could not ignore. And then, one detail slipped through that made his heart stop. For the first time in years, the powerful man felt a crack in his pride. Power has a strange way of convincing those who hold it that they are beyond reproach. For years, the boss had lived inside a fortress of his own authority, where every word he spoke became law and every judgment he made was unquestioned. He prided himself on his discipline, his order, his refusal to tolerate excuses. To him, the world was simple. You either delivered or you failed. And when the poor man walked in late that morning, sweating, breathless, and apologetic, the boss saw only failure. But now, days later, the whispers would not leave him. They echoed in his mind when he tried to sleep. They followed him through the halls of his glass tower, and finally, they led him to something he could not ignore, a glimpse of the truth. It began innocently, almost by accident. He had sent one of his staff to collect a file from the poor man's locker, intending to reassign his unfinished tasks. When the locker was opened, something unexpected spilled out. Not just old papers and notebooks, but a child's drawing. A sheet of paper, crumpled at the edges, with bright crayon colors etched across its surface. The boss watched as his assistant handed it to him, an awkward silence filling the room. It was a simple picture. A stick-figure family standing in front of a small home, smiling despite the shaky lines. At the bottom, in uneven letters, were the words, "Thank you, Papa." For a moment, the boss's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if trying to dismiss it as meaningless. But he could not look away. Something about the crude drawing, its innocence, its sincerity, pierced through the armor of his pride. It was not a spreadsheet, not an excuse scribbled on paper. It was love. The kind of love that belonged to a man who worked himself to the bone, not for prestige, not for wealth, but for the faces smiling in that drawing. The boss placed the paper on his desk, pretending it was nothing. But when he was alone, his gaze returned to it again and again. He thought of the whispers about a sick wife, about children needing care, about sacrifices made in silence. And for the first time, he wondered, had he been wrong? That question unsettled him more than anything else. He was not a man who doubted his own decisions. To him, doubt was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. But now, as he sat in his high-backed leather chair, surrounded by the gleam of wealth and power, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. Images haunted him. He remembered the poor man's face that morning, the way his chest heaved as if he had run miles, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the desperation in his eyes when he tried to explain. At the time, the boss had dismissed it as excuses. But now, layered against the whispers, against that drawing, it looked different. It looked like pain. It looked like sacrifice. The arrogance that had once fueled his outburst began to shift inside him. It didn't vanish. Men like him do not surrender pride easily. But it bent, it faltered, it cracked just enough for unease to seep through. He found himself restless in his own office, pacing the length of the glass windows that overlooked the city. The skyline spread beneath him, a kingdom he controlled, but for the first time, it felt hollow. What was power worth if it blinded him to humanity? He tried to shake it off. He reminded himself of his philosophy, repeating it like a mantra. Lateness is failure, excuses are weakness, compassion breeds mediocrity. But no matter how often he whispered it to himself, the words sounded emptier each time. Because now they clashed with the memory of that drawing, with the whispers of a sick wife, with the haunting thought that maybe he had condemned a man not for failure, but for love. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, the boss lingered at his desk. The city lights glowed against the glass walls, casting long shadows across his face. His hand hovered over the drawing again, his fingers brushing the edges of the paper. He closed his eyes, and for the briefest moment imagined what it must have felt like to be that man, torn between a sick wife and a demanding boss, between children waiting at the breakfast table and a clock that refused mercy. The thought made his chest tighten in a way he was unprepared for. The next morning, he walked into the office with his usual commanding presence, but those who looked closely could see the difference. His steps were just a little slower, his gaze more distant. He barked instructions, but his voice lacked the same sharpness. He was distracted, haunted by an image he could not escape. And though he tried to hide it, his staff noticed. For the first time, their powerful boss looked uncertain. He began asking questions in subtle ways, not enough to reveal his doubt, but enough to search for answers. Where exactly did he live? He asked one employee casually. Did anyone ever visit his home? He inquired of another. His curiosity was thinly veiled as routine, but everyone could sense it. The boss was chasing something, though he would never admit it. And yet, the more he learned, the heavier his unease grew. Each fragment of truth confirmed what he had feared. The poor man's life was not one of carelessness, but of crushing responsibility. Every minute of his day had been survival. Every second was borrowed against a mountain of sacrifice. The lateness was not neglect. It was evidence of love. By now, the boss's pride should have silenced these thoughts. But instead, it betrayed him. In quiet moments, he found himself thinking of his own life of privilege, of how he had never once worried about whether his children had food on the table or whether his wife would survive an untreated illness. He had built his empire on discipline, but discipline had been easy when comfort was guaranteed. For the first time, he recognized the difference. It wasn't that the poor man had failed discipline. It was that the boss had never truly known struggle. And that realization shook him to his core. He still held on to his pride, clinging to it as if it could shield him from the weight pressing down on his conscience. But deep inside, guilt had taken root, and guilt is not easily silenced. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the gravest mistake of his life. Determined to silence his doubt, he began digging into the poor man's life. The whispers had cracked something inside the boss, but he refused to admit it. To us, to himself, to anyone. He had built his empire on certainty, on rules carved in stone, on the belief that discipline and power were enough to govern men. Doubt was weakness, and weakness had no place in his world. And yet, the doubts lingered. They hovered in the back of his mind when he tried to work, when he tried to sleep, when he looked at the empty desk where the poor man once sat. It was as though silence itself mocked him, whispering, "What if you were wrong?" He told himself the whispers were nonsense. He told himself that the man's lateness was proof enough of failure. But guilt gnawed at him like a rat behind the walls, never visible but always present. And so he did what powerful men often do when their pride is threatened. He sought control. He would find the truth not because he cared, he convinced himself, but because he wanted to silence the whispers once and for all. He wanted to prove that his judgment had been right. That's how the investigation began. At first, it was subtle. He asked one of his drivers to pass by the neighborhood where the poor man lived, pretending it was for a delivery. The driver returned with an awkward look, describing narrow streets lined with crumbling apartments, laundry hanging from rusted balconies, children playing barefoot in alleyways. "It's not the kind of place you'd ever visit, sir," the driver said softly, and the boss's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. But curiosity once fed only grows hungrier. Soon, the boss himself sat in the back of his black luxury car, dark windows shielding him from view as it rolled slowly past the very place he had once dismissed as irrelevant. From behind the glass, he saw it all: the peeling paint, the broken steps, the tired faces of mothers carrying groceries that looked too light to feed their families. And then, he saw them, the poor man's children. A boy no older than 12, his school uniform too small for his growing frame, sat on the steps reading from a worn textbook, his lips moving as though reciting every word by heart. Beside him, a little girl clutched a stuffed toy whose seams had been stitched again and again, her small hands gripping it as though it were treasure. They laughed together despite the brokenness around them, the kind of laughter that is pure, unfiltered, untouched by shame. And for a moment, the boss felt something strange. Envy. For all his wealth, his own children had never laughed like that. He told himself it was coincidence, just a glimpse of life, nothing more. But something inside him shifted. He wanted to know more. So he dug deeper. He called in favors, asked quiet questions, and slipped money to men who knew how to find answers. Piece by piece, a story unfolded before him. He learned about the wife, bedridden with fever, surviving on home remedies because hospitals were a luxury they could not afford. He learned about the long nights the poor man worked extra shifts to keep food on the table, returning home with blistered hands and tired eyes, only to wake again before dawn. He learned how every spare coin went to his children's education, how he walked miles just to save bus fare, how he sacrificed meals so his family would not go hungry. Each detail landed like a hammer against the boss's pride. This was not the story of a careless man. This was the story of someone who carried the weight of the world in silence. Someone who bore responsibilities far greater than most could imagine. Someone who had been late not because he was lazy, but because love had demanded it of him. And then, one evening, unable to resist the pull of his curiosity, the boss went further than questions. He went himself. Dressed in plain clothes, stripped of his usual armor of suits and gold watches, he stood across the street from the poor man's building, hidden in the shadows, as life unfolded before him. He watched as the poor man returned home, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy but his face softening the moment he saw his children run to greet him. The boy proudly held up his textbook, babbling about a lesson he had mastered, while the girl lifted her toy as though showing off treasure. And despite the exhaustion clinging to him, the poor man knelt down, scooped them into his arms, and smiled. That smile was not the smile of a failure. It was the smile of a man who had nothing yet gave everything. The boss felt something tighten in his chest. For years, he had measured worth by punctuality, productivity, profit margins. But watching this scene, he realized he had never truly understood dignity. It was not in boardrooms or in polished offices. It was here, in the embrace of a father who had been willing to risk everything for the people he loved. The investigation he had begun to silence his doubt now screamed a truth he could no longer ignore. Every discovery humbled him. Every glimpse shattered the illusion of superiority he had built around himself. And still, he couldn't stop digging. He asked about the day of the lateness, desperate to know what exactly had delayed the man. What he learned left him speechless. The poor man had been tending to his feverish wife, preparing his children for school, running to catch buses that refused to wait. His lateness was not carelessness. It was love stretched thin across impossible choices. The boss returned home that night, but the luxury of his mansion no longer comforted him. The chandeliers looked gaudy, the polished floors hollow, the silence deafening. He poured himself a drink, but it did nothing to drown the images in his mind. The children's laughter, the drawing that said, "Thank you, Papa," the weary man who carried burdens with quiet dignity. For the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly, not as a man of discipline, but as a man of arrogance. And with every discovery, the rich man's arrogance began to crumble. What he finally uncovered left him speechless. For days, the investigation had consumed him. Every piece of the puzzle revealed sacrifice where he had expected carelessness, dignity where he had imagined laziness. And yet, despite all he had learned, one question still gnawed at him like a wound that refused to heal. What exactly happened that morning? What was it that had delayed the poor man, pushed him just past the boundary of punctuality, and condemned him to dismissal? He told himself he needed the answer for closure, to end the whispers that haunted his empire. But in truth, he needed it because the weight of guilt was already unbearable, and without understanding, it threatened to crush him entirely. The answer came to him in fragments, whispered by those who had seen what no one else in the office had cared to notice. A neighbor spoke first, her voice trembling as she recounted the morning she had seen him carrying his wife back to bed, her body burning with fever so high she could barely stand. "He wouldn't leave her," she said softly. "He stayed until she stopped shaking. I heard him telling her he'd be back as soon as he could, but he couldn't walk away while she suffered." The boss listened in silence, his throat dry. Already the guilt dug deeper, but the story was not finished. Another neighbor added that after tending to his wife, he had rushed to prepare his children for school. The boy's shirt was torn, and he had sat late into the night stitching it, only to wake at home dawn to wash it again. The little girl's shoes were nearly falling apart, and he had carefully wrapped tape around them so her feet wouldn't blister on the long walk to school. He had fed them the last of the bread and butter, kissed their foreheads, and sent them off with a smile that concealed the exhaustion in his own eyes. But there was more. One final voice, an older man who had ridden the same bus route for years, revealed the detail that broke everything. He told of how, on that very morning, as the bus rattled through the crowded streets, an elderly woman collapsed in the aisle. Her groceries spilled across the floor, her face pale as she gasped for breath. Most passengers looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. But not him. The poor man leapt forward, catching her before she struck the ground. He pressed water to her lips, steadied her trembling hands, and when the driver hesitated, he shouted for him to stop and take her to the nearest clinic. The bus had paused. Time had been lost. The minutes that could have saved his job had been spent saving a life. And when the woman was finally safe, he ran again, through streets, past traffic, toward an office that would never understand the reason for his lateness. By the time the story ended, the boss could no longer hold himself upright. He sank into a chair, his head heavy in his hands, as the truth crushed him beneath its weight. All his years of pride, his insistence that discipline came before all else, his arrogance that had silenced compassion, they all shattered against the reality of that morning. He had not fired a failure. He had not dismissed a careless man. He had condemned a hero, a man who had sacrificed his own security for the lives and dignity of others. The image replayed in his mind over and over again. The poor man kneeling beside his feverish wife, smiling for his children while hiding his own hunger, catching a stranger before she fell, saving her life at the cost of his own. Every detail was a dagger twisting deeper into the boss's chest. And with every revelation, the fortress of arrogance he had built around himself collapsed, brick by brick, until only guilt remained. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in his grand bed beneath silk sheets, staring at the ceiling while shadows of truth danced across his mind. He remembered his own words, the ones he had hurled so carelessly. "You're fired." He had shouted them with pride, with confidence, with the arrogance of a man who believed lateness was unforgivable. But now those words echoed like curses, poisoning the silence of his home. He thought of the poor man's children, smiling through their struggles, writing "Thank you, Papa" on crumpled paper with crayons. He thought of the woman whose life had been saved on that bus, a life that might have ended if not for the man he had dismissed. And he thought of himself, sitting in a glass tower, blind to the humanity that unfolded all around him. The guilt was unbearable. He paced the length of his study, staring out at the city lights, each one a reminder of lives he did not understand. For years, he had believed that power meant control, that wealth meant superiority, that rules meant justice. But in a single morning, a poor man had proven him wrong without even trying. Power was nothing without compassion. Wealth was empty without understanding. And rules without humanity were cruelty disguised as order. By dawn, his pride was gone. All that remained was the image of the man he had destroyed, and the unshakable knowledge that he had made the gravest mistake of his life. For the first time, the man who gave orders didn't know what to say. When their eyes met again, it was no longer employer and employee. It was man to man. The day of their meeting did not come easily. For the boss, every passing hour since uncovering the truth had been suffocating, each memory of that morning cutting him sharper than the last. He had built his entire identity on certainty, on being the man who never doubted himself, the man who always judged correctly. Yet now, doubt had not only entered his world, it consumed it. And so, driven by a mixture of guilt and desperation, he sought him out. The man he had fired. The man whose lateness was not carelessness but sacrifice. The man whose silence had humbled an empire built on arrogance. The encounter happened far away from glass towers and polished boardrooms. It was in the quiet of a modest neighborhood, where narrow streets twisted between buildings that leaned tiredly into one another, their cracked walls etched with years of struggle. The boss's expensive car drew uneasy stares as it rolled down those roads, a black shadow out of place in a world of patched roofs and rusted balconies. For the first time in years, he stepped out without the shield of authority, without a crowd of subordinates ready to obey his every word. He was simply a man, dressed in his fine clothes, standing awkwardly at the edge of a world he had never known. And then he saw him. The poor man was returning from a small market, a cloth bag slung over his shoulder, its weight pulling against his weary frame. His clothes were simple, worn thin in places, but his posture carried a dignity that not even poverty could strip away. His eyes, tired yet steady, lifted when he noticed the figure standing by the car. For a moment, recognition flickered across his face. The man who had humiliated him. The man who had stripped him of his livelihood. The air between them thickened, heavy with everything unspoken. When their eyes met again, it was no longer employer and employee. It was man to man. The boss opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he did not know how to begin. He, who had commanded boardrooms with a single glance, who had silenced subordinates with a raised hand, now stood mute before a man he had once dismissed as nothing. Pride wrestled with shame inside him, clashing like thunder in his chest. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but the words felt inadequate, too small to hold the weight of what he had done. The poor man broke the silence first. His voice was calm, steady, carrying neither bitterness nor anger. "Why are you here?" he asked simply, his gaze unwavering. The question struck harder than any insult. Why was he there? To redeem himself? To lessen his guilt? To somehow undo the wound he had caused? He did not know. All he knew was that he could not stay away, not after knowing the truth. His lips parted, his voice rough with the weight of shame. I was wrong." The poor man's expression did not change. No flicker of triumph, no smirk of victory. Only silence, the kind that holds more power than words ever could. And in that silence, the boss felt himself shrink. He had expected anger, perhaps even shouting. He had expected to be confronted with the same humiliation he had once inflicted. But instead, he was met with quiet strength, the kind that came not from wealth or authority, but from dignity. "I fired you," the boss continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't ask. I didn't listen. I thought lateness meant failure. But I know now. I know I was wrong." Still, the poor man said nothing. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the man before him, not with hatred, but with a depth of calm that unsettled him even more. It was as though the silence itself was judgment, as though every second unbroken by words forced the boss to feel the full weight of his arrogance. Finally, the poor man spoke again. "My wife was sick that morning. My children needed me, and on the way I helped a woman who collapsed on the bus. I was late because I could not turn my back on them. If that is failure in your world, then so be it." His tone was not bitter. It was resolute, unyielding, like a man who no longer sought approval from those who had mocked him. The boss's throat tightened. Hearing it from the poor man's lips was different from whispers or rumors. It was truth spoken with quiet dignity, and it humbled him more than any argument could. He lowered his gaze, something he had never done before in front of another man. "I see it now," he whispered, "and I don't know how to make it right." The poor man's response was devastating in its simplicity. "You cannot." The words hung in the air like a sentence passed down, not with cruelty, but with honesty. The boss flinched, his pride shattering further. He had spent his life believing money and power could fix anything, that authority could rewrite any mistake. But here, standing before a man who had nothing yet everything, he realized there were wounds no apology could heal, no wealth could erase. And yet, it wasn't anger in the poor man's eyes. It was strength, a quiet strength born from years of sacrifice, from surviving. humiliation, from carrying burdens that the rich man could never understand. It was the kind of strength that cannot be bought, cannot be crushed, cannot be silenced. And in that moment, the boss understood something he had never realized before. True power was not in commanding others, but in enduring without losing dignity. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The boss wanted to fill it, to beg, to explain, to offer anything that might restore what had been broken. But the poor man did not need his words. He did not need validation, or pity, or promises. His quiet dignity was enough. And in that silence, the roles shifted. And in that silence, the roles had reversed. The poor man held the power now. The poor man didn't seek revenge. His dignity was enough. There was a time when the boss would have laughed at the very idea of justice without punishment. In his world, justice was about dominance, winners and losers, orders and obedience, control and consequence. But standing in that quiet street, face to face with the man he had once humiliated, he was confronted with a truth he could no longer deny. Justice was not always loud. Sometimes it came wrapped in silence. Sometimes it spoke through dignity so unshakable that no insult, no dismissal, no power could erase it. The poor man did not lash out. He did not raise his voice, did not hurl back the kind of insults that had once cut into him like knives. He did not demand compensation, nor did he plead for his job. Instead, he stood tall with the weight of his struggles balanced on his shoulders, and he spoke only the truth. "I was late because I chose to care for those who depended on me," he said. "If that makes me unworthy in your eyes, then perhaps your eyes do not see clearly." His voice was steady, without bitterness, without malice, and yet it struck deeper than anger ever could. The boss flinched because there was no defense against truth spoken so plainly. Power had always been his shield, but here, against this man's quiet strength, his authority felt hollow. The silence that followed was not weakness, it was judgment, and it was unshakable. Word of the encounter began to spread, carried by those who had witnessed pieces of it or overheard fragments of conversation. Slowly, it seeped back into the office, weaving itself into the fabric of the workplace where whispers had once carried only fear. But this time, the whispers carried respect, not for the boss, but for the man who had once been dismissed. Co-workers who had watched in silence during his humiliation began to speak differently now. They recalled the way he had always greeted them with kindness, the way he had stayed late to help finish tasks no one else wanted, the way he had carried himself with humility even when mocked. They remembered, and they felt shame for their own silence. In their eyes, he became something larger than just an employee. He became a symbol of quiet strength, of endurance, of dignity that no dismissal could erase. Meanwhile, the boss felt the weight of every glance, every shift in the atmosphere. He had always believed his empire ran on fear. Fear of failure, fear of dismissal, fear of him. But now he realized fear was fragile. Respect was stronger, and respect was something he had never truly earned. One evening, he lingered in the office long after everyone else had gone. The city's lights stretched endlessly outside his window, glittering like a kingdom he had built. Yet for the first time it felt unstable. He thought of the poor man's words, of the silence that carried more weight than anger, and he realized his empire had never truly been his. It had been built by people, men and women whose sacrifices he had never cared to see, whose humanity he had overlooked, whose dignity he had dismissed. Without them, he was nothing more than one man sitting in a glass tower, surrounded by shadows of arrogance. The next day, when he walked into the office, his steps lacked their usual certainty. The employees felt it instantly. The air shifted, no longer heavy with fear, but charged with something else. Expectation. They watched him, not with admiration, but with curiosity. Would he change? Would he finally acknowledge what they all knew? For once, he did not raise his voice. He did not bark orders. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the faces that had once turned away from him in silence. And in that stillness, something inside him broke. His pride cracked, his arrogance shattered, and what remained was the uncomfortable but undeniable truth. He was no longer the center of their respect. That honor belonged to the man he had fired. Justice had come, but not through revenge. It had come through dignity, through silence, through the quiet power of a man who had chosen love over fear, compassion over cruelty. And the boss, for all his wealth and power, found himself humbled in ways he had never imagined possible. That night, he could not escape the memory of the poor man's eyes, calm, steady, unyielding. They haunted him, not because they held hatred, but because they held something he had lost long ago: integrity. And for the first time in his life, the man who had always spoken, who had always commanded, who had always filled silence with his own voice, did something he had never done before. He listened. For the first time, the rich man listened, truly listened. Arrogance fades, but humility leaves a legacy. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest of memories, but there are some moments so profound, so deeply etched into the soul, that they never fade. For the boss, the day he shouted, "You're fired!" in front of the entire office, should have been just another chapter in his long history of authority. He had dismissed many before, had silenced countless voices, had ruled through fear without once looking back. But this time was different. This time, the silence that followed did not bow to him. It rose against him. The legacy of that day lingered in every corner of the office. Employees who once cowered now whispered of dignity. They no longer admired wealth as blindly as before, no longer saw fear as strength. Instead, they carried with them the quiet image of a poor man who had walked out of those doors with his head bowed, but his pride unbroken. His story became their reminder that true worth is not measured by punctuality or profit, but by the choices made in the moments that test humanity. And the boss, the man who once believed himself untouchable, began to change. It did not happen overnight. Arrogance is not easy to shed, especially when it has been worn like armor for years. But slowly, the cracks widened. He no longer barked orders with the same certainty, no longer dismissed late arrivals without a question, no longer measured his employees solely by what they produced. Instead, he began to ask questions he had never thought to ask before. Are you well? Is your family safe? Do you need help? For a man who had once prided himself on ruthlessness, these words felt foreign on his tongue. But the truth of the poor man's sacrifice haunted him too deeply to return to the man he once was. He visited the family once more, quietly, without announcement. He brought no entourage, no gifts wrapped in pride, only his presence. The poor man's children looked at him with cautious eyes, unsure whether to fear or trust him. The wife, still recovering, offered him a frail smile, and in that small gesture he felt something he had never felt before: humility. He realized that his power meant nothing here. Money could not erase their struggles, and apologies could not undo their pain. What mattered was respect, and respect could only be earned, never demanded. Back in the office, the story spread beyond whispers. It became a lesson. Younger employees told it to newcomers, not as gossip, but as warning. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake poverty for failure. Never mistake arrogance for strength. And slowly, the culture shifted. The fear that once ruled the office gave way to something else: understanding. The employees worked harder, not because they feared punishment, but because they respected the lesson left behind. The boss himself became a quieter man. He still wore his tailored suits, still drove his luxury cars, still signed deals that moved millions. But beneath it all, there was a weight in his eyes, a reminder that power is fragile, that arrogance is fleeting. In his meetings, he sometimes paused mid-sentence, his gaze drifting as if remembering the man he had dismissed. He no longer saw lateness as betrayal. Instead, he saw it as a story waiting to be heard. And the poor man? Though he never returned to that office, his presence lingered stronger than ever. He found work elsewhere, modest but steady, and continued to carry his family through the storms of life. But to the people he had left behind, he was no longer just the fired man. He was the man who had changed the way an empire thought. He was the man whose dignity had humbled the arrogant. He was the man who had proven that true strength is not in shouting orders, but in standing tall even when the world tries to push you down. Years later, the boss would still remember his eyes, that steady, calm gaze that had stripped him of every illusion of power. He would remember the silence, heavier than words, that had forced him to confront his own failings. And he would remember the lesson, carved deeper into him than any business loss, any victory, any deal he had ever made. Because in the end, arrogance fades, titles fade, money fades. But humility leaves a legacy. And that legacy is not written in glass towers or bank accounts. It is written in the lives touched by dignity, in the stories passed from one generation to the next, in the reminder that respect matters more than fear. The boss, once feared and admired for his power, was remembered differently after that. Not for his wealth, not for his empire, but for the moment he was humbled by a poor man's truth. And in the hearts of those who knew the story, the legacy was clear. Respect outlasts power, and dignity outshines arrogance. And that's how a poor man, once fired in shame, became the reason a powerful man was humbled. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what lesson you took from it. Don't forget to hit the like button if you believe respect is greater than power. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, shock, and make you think. And remember, every story we tell here is a reminder that dignity can rise from anywhere,